Hey, we are back with a new episode on codependency. I have found that I was wrong.
Well, wait a minute. Is this on? Is this thing recording? Was that documented?
Yes, I was absolutely wrong. Stick around because we said some wrong things last time about codependency.
We? I thought you said you. Is this a we thing now?
It is a we thing.
Real life for real families. Hurts, habits, and hang-ups happen in every family.
Jerry and I are here with tools to help you trust God, clean house, and tell the truth to ramp up the joy in your family.
You have what it takes.
It's time to become sober on purpose for His purpose. So I'm 3 weeks into my Codependency Anonymous meetings, and I'm learning an enormous amount because we've been in Celebrate Recovery, AA, Al-Anon, and I still am finding that codependency is something really hard to nail down.
Would you say that there's different things, different tools you're being taught at these as opposed to the other programs?
So one of the things that I learned in Codependency Anonymous is that they do not do a definition. It's kind of like AA folks of nobody calls you out on being an alcoholic. You have to name yourself as an alcoholic.
Oh, that reminds me of a great joke.
Okay.
Do you know what the difference between an alcoholic and somebody who drinks too much is?
No, Jerry. What's the difference?
An alcoholic goes to meetings.
So codependency kind of has that same self-labeling process that nobody's going to call you a codependent. You have to either label yourself or look at the characteristics. So what Codependency Anonymous does is it lays out a bunch of patterns and characteristics. And I'm just going to give you, I'll put the link in the show notes, but I'm just going to give you the major headers of them, not the actual, I'm not going to read through all the actual characteristics, but denial patterns, low self-esteem patterns, compliance patterns, control patterns, and avoidance patterns. And then they give you about 10 different things underneath that that talk about what all of those patterns are. And the preamble to the meeting also has a whole bunch of questions that you kind of ask yourself on how you've been handling your life and whether you're a codependent or not. One of the main thing I want to talk about this time is counter dependence. And that really blew my mind. It functions so totally different than codependency, but it all falls under the same umbrella. And you can also talk about it as the needy versus the avoidant codependent.
I could? Is it when you said you could, are you referring to me talking about the needy versus the codependent?
I'm talking about as we look at counter dependence, it's in a way, it's the total opposite of codependency. Tell me what you think of when you think of the classic codependent.
I think of somebody who seeks out unhealthy individuals to be a part of their life in an effort to, really, to be completely frank, in an effort to cast some blame on them, on this individual, so that they don't have to take responsibility for their own shortcomings.
But if you had to describe that person, like in a movie, what would they look like?
What would they look like in a movie? Anybody who hung out with Arthur. Remember Arthur?
Our audience has to be old to remember that. But what would typically she look like?
Well, they would look like...
or act like?
Well, they would act like somebody who was consistently setting expectations for other people in their life. They would look like somebody who got upset and was consistently let down. They would look like somebody who was unable to focus on their own self-betterment and needed to focus on other people's improvements.
If we had to put it in a character, it would typically be a woman, probably married, who felt that life was not going well and that she had to control her husband, and then would go out for drinks with her girlfriends and complain about her husband, and then come home and be sometimes angry and sometimes just go along with everything.
I didn't say that.
But that's what I'm saying, is that's kind of the picture we have of the codependent. I think that's kind of the picture that the AA book gives us, too, of the wife who, is financially and emotionally tied to the alcoholic so much so that their life is wrapped around them and they can't separate themselves from it.
Well, you triggered me. Well, why would they be financially tied?
Well, when the Big Book was written in 1930, they were financially tied. They just didn't have the options that we have now to make money. So that's when that was written. It was really a financial situation. And oftentimes women with children, it's really hard to maintain a full-time, well-paying job and raise children. So anyway, we've got this person who we typically typify in a movie as a woman who, as you said, is not invested in her own life, but is invested in the husband's life or the children's life or the friend's life or something like that. In the definition, when you're looking at this, you have all these characteristics, and what we think of classically is someone who can't trust themselves. And so they go about managing everybody else's life because they can't trust who they are, and they're not comfortable in their own skin.
I think trust might not, and I don't really understand. I'm sure I'm codependent to some extent, but I think trust might not be the right word. I think maybe they don't want to focus on themselves. They don't want to examine their own hurts, habits, or hang-ups, and therefore it's much easier to just avoid that by looking at the hurts, habits, and hang-ups of other people.
And they often seem selfless. They're often the caretakers, the people who bring the potlucks to church, who take care of everything, who work themselves to death, and they often seem like wonderful people, but they're killing themselves on the inside.
Yeah.
So let's go on to the counter-dependent. And that's a very interesting thing. They're just as ill-adapted for the world, but instead of not trusting themselves to manage their lives, which is what the codependent does, they don't trust others. So whatever their childhood experience has been, typically it happens in childhood, is they find that they can't trust anybody else, and they're often overachievers, workers, people who take care of everything themselves. They're the person who says, well, I'll just do it myself because it's too uncomfortable to trust you to do it. Instead of this high level of vulnerability that often the codependent has, they have a very low level of vulnerability, and they have really hard time with intimacy.
So, wow, because I'm definitely, after you listed off those criteria, I'm without a doubt interdependent. Why would you
Counterdependent?
That's what I said.
Interdependent is the healthy
right.
part.
That's what I said. Counterdependent. That's what I said. I lost my train of thought, but you had touched on something, and I was kind of going to ask you for some clarity, but maybe it'll come back up later.
Okay, so here is the definition of the counterdependent. Since we all kind of have, I wouldn't say all of us, but a lot of us have a sense of what a codependent is. A counterdependent has difficulty being close to others, a strong need to be right all the time, self-centered and egotistical, a resistance or refusal to ask for help, expects perfection in self and others, and extreme discomfort appearing weak or vulnerable, has difficulty relaxing, and is addicted to activities like work or exercise. This is out of Psychology Today by a gentleman named, he listed all this out, George Hedriquez, PhD. And one of the things that he talks about is that this counterdependent on the surface looks like an interdependent. And an interdependent, we'll go into definitions of that probably in the next podcast, but that's the person who is able to self-regulate, have deep, intimate relationships, and when appropriate, ask for help or move away if they're being overwhelmed by other people. So they can self-regulate pretty well. Whereas the counterdependent looks that way on the surface, but most of their relationships are only superficial. They have really struggled to ask for help, and they pretty much don't trust anybody. Whatever their childhood circumstances, it became very clear to them early on that trusting somebody either got you hurt or didn't ever come to fruition.
I'm going to change my self-diagnosis. I'm going to diagnose myself as an interdependent with some very minor codependent and what was the other one? And counter-dependent tendencies. Very minor, though.
So, and that's what I'm learning at the Coda meetings is this is something that may fluctuate depending on relationships. But one of the things that the counter-dependent does is autonomy to the extreme. So this is the person who may rise to the top, but once they get there, it feels very empty because there's nobody to share it with. There's no deep connection. In a marriage, it can look very much like two people living under the same roof, living very separate lives, not dreaming together, not setting up their lives together, but being married.
What about in a single setting, like in it with somebody who's not engaged in an emotional relationship?
Well, I mean, we're all pretty much engaged in some level of emotional relationships, but counter-dependent can look like the person who is a high achiever. They can look a lot of ways, but they can look like the high achiever and they can look like they have a lot of friends, but there's no deep connection in the friendships. They're just being able to be with those people for this amount of time. Push comes to shove. You know, if they broke their leg or something, there really isn't a deep friendship. There isn't a deep connection anywhere.
Like Michael Jackson.
I have no idea. I have no idea. That's just crazy.
That's kind of random.
That is random. And their self-reliance is over the top. So in the broken leg situation where you really can't help yourself, they would still continue to try and do everything for themselves, even though that's a very legitimate reason to need people.
Okay. I know as you read those criteria that I see a lot of that tendency in my professional life where as a manager, it's really important that I'm slowing down and maybe even at the cost of efficiency and productivity and even making better margins in our profit analysis to invest into my people so that they're more resourceful and able to grow in time with what needs to be done. Yet my inclination is totally to just do it now and get it done because I know I can get it. I know I can do it faster and I know I can do it better. Would you say that was interdependent or, counterdependent?
Counterdependent. It is. I think the strongest example we can talk about is counterdependent and codependent can also be called needy and avoidant. And what happens, which I think is really interesting, and I think this plays out in most marriages, is just the depth of it is what you would look for. The needy dependent will go chasing the avoidant dependent and do for them and be there for them and arrange dates and make sure that things are together and force having family time and dinner time and all of that. We'll do it and do it and do it and do it until they get exhausted. And when they get exhausted, then they go away. And that triggers the avoidant dependent to say, hey, wait a minute. All this stuff was happening, but now it's not happening anymore. So the avoidant goes running for the needy codependent. These are the extremes. Goes running for the needy codependent. Says, hey, where are you? Why are you not here? Why are you not doing this anymore? I'm worried about you. Are you leaving me? Is something happening? Blah, 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 blah. And if the needy says, no, everything's fine, and the avoidant feels that everything is fine, then the avoidant will go away again. So
it's like this tug of war, right?
Yeah, it's this constant chasing
we
each
do
other.
this. You and I do this where you'll be like, I need your attention, I need this now, and until I shut down, and then eventually you'll get tired of doing what you're doing. You'll begin to pull away because you're not getting any benefit from all this effort to bring me in. And then after a while of you being checked out, then I'll be like, what's going on? And I'll approach you, and then correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm imagining begin to feel like, oh, look, I'm getting what I needed from him. He's engaging with me. He cares. And then you'll begin to re-engage, at which point I'll check back out.
Yes. So those are the extreme patterns. And we do play that. We don't always play that, but we do play that. It helps to know why we play that. And part of it is this back to I'm trusting somebody else to run my life. And I would say you don't trust anybody to run your life.
What about my creator? What about looking for direction from the Spirit?
Well, in a Christian context, that would be why all of this should be turned on its ear, and the only thing that really can satisfy the needs of the counter or the codependent is a healthy relationship with Jesus. And once that relationship is established, then it's no longer difficult to work with other human beings because you are completely loved and cared about. You're made worthy by Him, and you're never alone.
I am completely loved and cared about. I am not alone.
But that's what Jesus says to all people who choose to walk in faith with Him. Is He says, "I will do this for you."
Now, I'm going to challenge you on this. Now, you know that a relationship with Jesus and with God is important to me. But I think it's a stretch to say that unless you have that relationship, that you can't be an emotionally mature and healthy individual. I think that there are other consequences that will come about, but I do believe I personally have met, emotionally mature people who don't claim Jesus Christ as their personal Lord and Savior.
I can see that too. What the basis is, we all need, and we talked about this earlier, we all need love, significance, and security. And so if you can find that without God, then you can build on your emotional maturity. And you would have to find that somewhere else. So however they've done that, they have found love, significance, and security either in themselves or in someone else or in a cause or in some kind of belief system.
Okay, good. We're in agreement.
Right. So yes, you could do that. But when your world shakes, those are often the first things to go. Love, significance, and security. So without Jesus, I truly am not sure how emotionally mature people do it. I mean, we'd have to get some on the podcast and interview them. I don't pretend to understand how people manage without at least a belief in a higher power, something greater than themselves. And for me personally, it's to find that I can trust myself and trust my decisions and let go of my codependency because Jesus has got this.
Yeah. And I mean, in my experience, the only thing in my life that really, or the only person in my life who's never, ever left me when things get really, really bad is Jesus, is the Holy Spirit. And how, I don't know how people without faith can maintain consistency. I don't even know if they can when things get really rough. And gosh, this is I'm kind of going off on tangent here, but first of all, I don't know if I've ever really witnessed one of these secular people in a real crisis. I think I only see them in their best. And second, when I'm in a real crisis and I'm getting comfort and security from my higher power, it doesn't look pretty to the outside world because I'm in a real crisis. But I do know that He's there for me.
Well, and I do think, as we're teasing this out, so the codependent is constantly trying for intimacy, but they really don't know what it is or how to get it or how to feel full when they do get it. And the avoidant, the counterdependent, is running from intimacy. So when Jesus offers intimacy to us, both of those actions can creep up on us. So the avoidant would say, no, I've got this. And the codependent would say, hey, well, I'll listen to you as soon as I take care of this, this, and this, or I'll take care of something else. So those things could also trigger that why we can't have an in-tune, intimate relationship with Jesus, because both of these very end of the spectrum issues trigger that as well.
We're totally like emotional nerds. You know what I mean? Like wonkish on the emotional thing here. I mean, this is really deep.
Well, but that's where we're trying to go. Why offer people something they already have? Because when I read The Counterdependent, I went, oh, that makes perfect sense. And I've read a little bit about this before, but that makes perfect sense on why we do this dance. And I don't know that it necessarily falls along gender lines. And the reading I've done so far says it has to do more with who your initial caregivers were, on whether they were available for you or not, and how they were available for you.
Is the implication here that if you had very present caregivers, there's a tendency to become codependent? And if you had distant caregivers, that you would become, oh gosh, counterdependent?
No, actually, if you had present, mature caregivers, you're probably interdependent, which means that you can manage yourself, you can manage your feelings, you take help and you achieve intimacy when appropriate in relationships, and that you are able to do autonomy as well. If you had present, mature caregivers. If you had caregivers who were dealing with their own issues and were not available to you in many different ways, or were living their lives through you, or saw you as the fulfillment of their lives, then you went to either end of the spectrum.
So, because initially when you started talking like this, I was assuming we're talking about the amount of time that could be devoted to the child, but it sounds more like the idea here is that the amount of emotional engagement that could, and then healthy emotional engagement.
Yes, and we're going to get into that later because I think that's the next step. Dr. Gabor Mate talks about this as well, and I've got some articles on that. He doesn't believe that addiction is a disease. He believes it's an attachment disorder. That when you were supposed to get the information you needed as an infant, toddler, or small child, your caregiver was unavailable. And it could be depression, it could be drugs and alcohol, it could be work, it could be being orphaned, it could be all kinds of things that were no fault of that caregivers. They just were not available to do that.
Let's be clear, addiction's nothing but bad boundaries. We talked about that in a previous episode. You can go back in our files and listen to all of them. Listen to him again. That's what I do.
He actually does. But here's the thing. Counter and codependency are not things you're stuck with. You can overcome this. Once you realize what healthy interdependency, autonomy, and then ability to be vulnerable and intimate are, you can step through those windows and work through that and achieve that goal that you want, the connection that you want with your spouse, with your children, with your friends, those types of things in appropriate ways. I'm not saying you can clear up somebody else's, but you can clear it up for yourself.
And I'm inclined to say, and my instinct is to say that these things, these interdependence, these codependence, these counterdependence tendencies are not inherently bad by themselves or good by themselves. They just are. And like anything, when we become out of balance and we are unable to regulate our behaviors or our internal dialogue, that's where we get unhealthy. But to say that, I am my past. I said to the pastor the other day when we were talking, and just in general, and he was talking about some of the mistakes of his past, and I looked at him and I said, "So would you have done it differently?" And then he kind of took a couple steps back and he said, "Oh, wow. I don't know. I mean, if I did it differently, I wouldn't be who I am today. And I'm really happy with who I am." So I'm hesitant to label any of these things as bad.
They're not bad. They're on a continuum. So just like any other continuum, if you're way at one end or way at the other, then you may struggle with the relationships. So there is a time to be totally dependent. It is age sensitive. So when the infant is totally dependent on the parents, that's age appropriate. When the toddler is venturing out but still has a lot of dependence on the parents, also age appropriate. It's as we mature and don't mature out of that complete dependence on somebody else or complete independence from somebody else that we run into issues. Because one of the biggest joys in being human is to be able to connect with another person deeply, to be known, just like we have the option to be known by God if we choose to be.
It's good stuff, Tanya. That's good stuff. No, I mean, you nailed it. I don't know what else to say.
I don't know about you, but as I learn more, it gives me a lot more hope that these are not permanent things in my life and that I can change.
Yeah, as I learn more, I feel the same way, but I also feel I can recognize how far I've come, provided that I'm keeping a focus on where my start point was. You know, in AA, we talk a lot about the start point and remembering that, not letting it go away, because, you know, in AA, we say the farther you are away from the beginning, the closer you are to starting over.
Well, and that's what gives me hope with this continuum of we are all on this spectrum between counterdependency and codependency. We're all in there, with interdependency being in the middle, the ideal, and, you know, perfectionism is the enemy of done. So we're not going to get to perfect, but how do we get to better? And I think both you and I have used sponsors to do that and therapists, but now that we're coming on a horizon of a new group of folks that are called coaches. And I know that I wish when we left our therapist, we had had some coaching to help us think forward and implement the tools that he gave us.
Yeah, I would agree. A coach would have been a very beneficial tool, especially if they were somebody who had experience in what we were struggling with as individuals, particularly.
And coaching is something we're going to continue to talk about because we're thinking about offering services as coaches ourselves. And a coach is a forward thinker. This is not someone who digs in the past. This is someone who helps you implement your goals towards moving forward. So we'd love to hear your comments either on the show notes over at thejoyousfamily.com, on the joyousfamily.com Facebook page, or on Sober on Purpose Facebook group. So let us know. You can also email me at Tanya, Tanya, at thejoyousfamily.com, and let us know, have you been coached? What do you think about coaching? Is that something that works for you? We're interested in your opinion on that. The final thing is we are still looking for those 30 by the end of March, 30 reviews on iTunes. It's really simple. All you have to do is get on iTunes, scroll down just a little bit. Below available episodes will be the reviews. So this is our 15th or 16th episode. We're moving right along, and we'd love to have some reviews from you.
All right. Bye-bye for now.